Welcome to our weekly Bible Reader Companion series. This week our reading is taken from Romans chapters 12 through 16 and 1 Thessalonians chapters 1 through 5. And our memory verse is taken from Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. From the New King James, our memory verse reads, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Let's consider the verse we find in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3 as a follow-on from our beginning discussion yesterday in verses 1 and 2. Romans 12 and verse 3 reads, "For I say, through the grace of God given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." In the context of Romans 12 verses 3 through 21, it teaches us how to be a living sacrifice that is acceptable to God. Specifically, as we just read in our passage here in verse 3, this idea of thinking soberly. We must have a proper estimation of ourselves to be worthy servants of God. Soberness means to be in one's right mind as to exercise self-control. Here, the idea seems to be to put a moderate estimate upon oneself or think of oneself soberly, as Thayer puts it. We must see ourselves as servants of God, not as servants of self. Otherwise, we will make little sacrifice for the sake of Christ. Speaking God's word in order to address the spiritual needs of men and women is an action of divine grace, as Paul speaks there in the beginning of verse 3. Paul makes this point multiple times in his writings as he refers to his ministry as an act of grace given to him by God. And that truth certainly applies to everyone who is among you, as Paul writes. Divine truth knows no partiality. Therefore, we are warned against a conceited, arrogant frame of mind toward God's truth. Arrogance prevents the wisdom of sound judgment. Truly, arrogance is an attribute of a fool whose prideful trust is in his own reasoning. From the proverb writer in Proverbs 18 and verse 2, the passage reads, "A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart." Faith produces humility toward God's truth, not arrogance or pride. Faith does not argue against God's truth, it accepts it. Faith does not elevate human reasoning, it submits to the infinitely superior will of God. The word soberly in our text today means to be in one's right mind, as we've already mentioned. When a Christian is arrogant, he is not in his right mind. We must have the mind of Christ, that humble and that obedient attitude that he displayed, and not the conceited mind, of the world. As we consider being the living sacrifice for God, let us be mindful that we need to be transformed by the gospel and walk by faith in him. Think on our memory verse, Romans 12 and verse 2, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Thank you, and join us again tomorrow as we continue to meditate on God's word together.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook for more content like this.